Items and weapons are a key part of gameplay loops in bullet hell roguelites, such as Enter the Gungeon or The Binding of Isaac. And if they're done correctly, they can enhance a game on so many different levels. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mochibeans channel. I'm Caden, and today we're going to be discussing items and weapons in video games, and how to make them effective at their many purposes, using a mixture of art and game design. So, I mentioned only bullet hell roguelites, but items are useful for so many other game genres. For instance, survival games, FPSs, sandbox games, battle royales. So this video will show you what's in a good item set and how to make one yourself. I'll also go through the process of how to design these items and weapons, from planning and preparation all the way to the finished product. So let's get started. I've looked through some of the games which I think use items effectively, and found 4 main reasons that they have them in the game. Keep them in mind for the entire design process. So I'm going to begin with probably the most obvious reason, which is for variety. Having a large range of items will increase the replay value or replayability of your game. Depending on the weapon you start off with, you can be up close to enemies, using a melee weapon and defensive items. However, starting with an effective ranged weapon will transform your playstyle, leading to you often standing away from the enemy and firing from afar. The more weapons and items you have, the more a player will feel like they have the ability to be creative or experiment. And this leads to them discovering synergies with items and weapons, which can be quite interesting. The next idea is immersion. Players become immersed into a game when the world feels tangible or alive. It's how separate and unique you can make the areas in your world feel from each other, while keeping the overall atmosphere of your game the same. It's quite a difficult balance to find, but items help in the sense that they can all be quite unique and different, but you can relate them to different things in the world to make them feel more connected. Next is reliability. Items and weapons have to be useful for players to use them. Players rely on items and weapons, especially in bullet hell games, to get them through the run. It's a mix between the tools that they have available to them, being the items and weapons, and also their personal skill and mastery of the game. If healing items in your game are very common, then players will be less scared to experiment because they know that they'll be able to recover using those items. This makes it an easy way to discourage and encourage different types of gameplay. If you have less of one type of item, such as how Enter the Gungeon barely has any melee weapons, there's not much reason for players to fight up close to an enemy. So it's a very simple way of manipulating how you want the game to feel. And the last idea is progression. A sense of progression throughout the game with better items and better weapons as you go will give the player a feeling of improvement. It's like a reward for not dying, or a reward for just playing the game in general. If harder enemies drop more loot, then the players will be encouraged to try and reach the level where they can end up beating those harder enemies, and also the bosses. You have to make it obvious that certain items are better than others, even if you want a balanced game. Punishment and reward are vital ideas in game design. So now that you know the reasons why items are in games, we can move on to designing and applying our knowledge. I'd recommend, similarly to what we did in lesson 2, to make a reference that you can go off when you're making the art for the items. I found that the easiest way to do this is just to write a list of all of the items you want. You can see that I've organized mine in items and weapons, and in those categories are smaller subcategories. The way I created this was I started with a basic framework of the list, before even including any of the weapons or items. Then I started filling in those empty bullet points with anything that came to my head. One thing I see a lot is when people want a really diverse item set with really unique weapons, but because they want their list to be perfect, they just keep trying to think of really good ideas. But sometimes the best ideas just come from you brainstorming and writing anything down that comes to your head. Trying to create the perfect item list also results in sometimes overcomplicating items. This is the one thing you have to avoid, and this goes for the art as well. If you make the item's purpose or the item's art way too complicated and hard to understand, the readability of the design goes down. A good way to countering this is to imagine every item having a gimmick or some short definition. You can see that next to my item names, I have a really simple description which only goes on for about 1 or 2 lines. The general way I stop myself from overcomplicating the description is just to limit myself to about 1.5 lines of text. If the minimum description you need for your item goes over 2 lines, it might be too complicated for the game, because remember, the player will have to understand this when they're in the game, and normally they don't really want to be bogged down in the details of everything. So you'll need just a short text which tells them what the item they picked up is for. For example, a gun that heals you when you shoot but you don't get any money. That doesn't take up over 2 lines, and it's very simple for the player to understand. There's a very obvious reason or scenario to use it in, and there's a very obvious reason or scenario to not use it in. If you want money, you probably don't want to use it, but if you want health, you probably do. So you can see that there's already a very clear idea of the item in the player's head, just by reading a line of text. So at first, jot down any ideas you have, and then afterwards, when you're happy with the amount of ideas you have, you can start taking away for you, including simplifying the descriptions of items that you're actually pretty happy with, just to make them shorter and easier to understand. Just a quick last note on the functionality of items and weapons. If there aren't any scenarios in which your item is bad to use in the game, then it's not a very good item. I know it sounds kind of contradictory, but the thing is, if there's no scenario which you can't use it in, then it's not very fun because you can just use it everywhere and it'll work fine. Games become slightly repetitive and boring if there's no difficult decision making. At this stage of the design process, the most important point out of the 4 points we talked about before is probably progression, because this is where you're deciding all of the abilities that the items have, and you want a clear ranking system so that you know which ones can go in which chests, depending on the rarity and overall powerfulness of the weapon. Okay, art time. So now that you have the list, you can start drawing and designing your items. I always start with drawing all of the items in the same sprite so that I can see what they look like next to each other. As you can see, I've started with a grid, a palette, and the player character we designed in episode 2. The reason I have varying sized squares in the grid is because I want the ability to be able to make some of the items and weapons bigger than others. I'm again going to be using the palette I've used for all of the other art sprites in the game, just to keep everything consistent. The last thing I have is a sprite of my player character. This is so that I can see all of the weapons and items next to it, just to check that it doesn't look slightly off or weird. Most of the time, these items and weapons will be seen next to the player sprite, so if it looks strange, it'll be quite noticeable. That being said, lots of bullet hell games have overly sized or massive weapons to try and give a comedic feel to the entire game overall. Just as a quick note, a lot of the items and weapons that we've made are actually suggested by our Discord server. The invite link is in the description to every one of our videos, so if you're interested in joining, just go to the description below. Anyway, back to the art. Anytime I start drawing an item, I pick a random colour from my colour palette and start blocking out the shape. Once I've got to a rough shape that I like, I'll start adding some flat colours to just see where my design is heading. The final step I take is polishing. This means just cleaning up the lines and everything to just make it look nice, as well as adding shadings and highlights. Again, I want to think about where my light source is so that everything is consistent. For all of my items and weapons, the light source is coming from the top, apart from some where I want to change it to give it a more ominous feel, or if I want it to feel more unique. So, items are as simple as that. All you have to do is create the list, and then draw the list. Also, once you're done drawing them, put them into different sprites so it becomes easier to code. Doing this will also let you put animations in, such as a spinning gold coin or anything else that you just want to add for fun. While you're separating them into different sprites, don't forget that for weapons, you need 2 different sprites. One with the gun just normally, and one with the hand holding the gun. Remember how we removed one of the arms from the player because we said we'd do something with it later? Most of the time the player is going to be holding a gun, therefore you need the hand around the gun sprite because of how we're coding it. That being said, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this. If you followed this tutorial, I'd really enjoy seeing your item set, so you can join our Discord server and putting it in the art chat there, which is dedicated just for stuff like this. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!